Hey Siri, set a timer until 7:50 a.m.
Your timer alarm is set for 7:50 a.m.
Sevastopol in May. 6 months have now passed since the first cannonball came hurling over from the bastions of Sevastopol to churn up the earth on the enemy's works. Ever since then, thousands of shells, cannonballs, and bullets have been fired from the bastions at the enemy trenches and from those trenches back at the bastions, and the angel of death has hovered ceaselessly above them. During this time, thousands of individual personal vanities have been insulted, thousands have been gratified, and thousands have gone to rest in the arms of death. How many military decorations have been pinned on, how many stripped off, how many St. Anne ribbons and orders of St. Vladimir have been awarded? How many pink coffins and linen pals have gone to the grave? And still the same booming resounds from the bastions. Still on clear evenings the French survey, with involuntary trepidation and the superstitious dread, the yellowish churned up earth of the Sevastopol bastions, and the outlines of the Russian sailors moving about on them. And still they count the embrasures from which the cast iron cannon angrily bristle. Still, as before, from the tower on Telegraph Hill, a navigational NCO examines through a telescope the brightly colored figures of the French forces, their batteries, their tents, their columns moving on the green hill, and the puffs of smoke that leap up from their trenches. And still, inspired by the same zeal, oddly assorted companies of men with desires that are even more oddly assorted come flocking, struggling their way from different corners of the earth towards this fatal spot. But the dispute which the diplomats have failed to settle is proving to be less amenable to settlement by means of gunpowder and human blood. A strange thought often used to occur to me. What if one of the warring sides were to propose to the other side that each should dismiss one soldier from its ranks? That might seem an odd thing to do, but why not try it? Then a second soldier from each side could be told to go, followed by a third, a fourth, and so on until each army had only had one soldier left. This always assuming that the two armies were equal in strength and that it would be possible to substitute quality for quantity. Finally, if it still appeared that the really complex disputes arising between the rational representatives of rational creatures must be settled by combat, let the fighting be done by these two soldiers. One could lay siege to the town and the other could defend it. This argument may seem to be no more than a paradox, yet it is a sound one. For in truth, what difference is there between one Russian fighting one Allied representative and 80,000 Russians fighting 80,000 Allied representatives? 135,000 against 135,000, 20 against 20, 1 against 1. None of these figures is any more logical than another, or it might be argued the latter figure is by far the most logical, because it represents the most humane suggestion. Of one of two things appears to be true. Either war is madness, or if men perpetuate this madness, they thereby demonstrate that they are far from being the rational creatures we for some reason commonly suppose them to be. 2. In the besieged town of Sevastopol, a regimental band was playing next to the pavilion on the boulevard, and crowds of military men accompanied by women were moving gaily along the paths in holiday mood. A bright spring sun had ascended the morning sky above the English positions, had moved over to the bastions, then to the town, and the Nicholas barracks, and, shining with equal joy and awe, was now descending towards the far-off dark blue sea, whose even swell gleamed with a silvery sheen. A tall, slightly stooping infantry officer, pulling on a glove that was, if not immaculately white, at least fairly presentable, emerged from the gate of one of the little seamen's houses on Main Street, and looking reflectively at the ground as he walked, set off up the hill towards the boulevard. The expression on this officer's plain, low-browed face bespoke limited intellectual ability, but it also reflected a certain sober-mindedness, honesty, and inclination towards tidiness. He was of poor build, long-legged, awkward, and somewhat diffident in his movements. He wore a smart new cap, a thin summer greatcoat of a slightly peculiar lilac shade, from beneath the breast of which a gold watch chain peeped. His trousers had footstraps, and he was shod in a pair of calf leather boots that were clean and shiny, though slightly worn at the heels in several places. It was, however, less from these items, which are not commonly encountered upon the persons of an infantry officer, than from the man's general bearing, that an experienced military eye was at once able to perceive that this was no ordinary infantry officer, but someone a little higher up in rank. He might have passed for a German if his facial features had not belied his purely Russian origins, or he might have been an adjutant or a regimental quartermaster. But then he would have worn spurs, or an officer who had been transferred from the cavalry or possibly the guards for the duration of the campaign. In fact, he had been transferred from the cavalry, and at this moment, as he made his way up to the boulevard, he was thinking about a letter he had just received from an old military friend and colleague, now retired, a landowner in the province of T, and his wife, the pale, blue-eyed Natasha, who was a great friend of the officer's. He was thinking in particular about one passage in the letter, where his comrade had written, "When our copies of the veteran are delivered, Papuka, such was the pet name of the retired Ulan, had given his wife, rushes headlong into the hallway, seizes the newspapers, and runs off with him to the S-shaped seat in the arbor, or the drawing-room, in which you'll remember we whiled away the winter evening so gloriously when your regiment was stationed in our town, and you simply can't imagine the excitement with which she reads about your noble exploits. She often says of you that Mikhailov, she says, such a darling man, I feel like smothering him with kisses whenever I set eyes on him. He's fighting in the bastions, he's sure to get the St. George's Cross, and be written about in the newspapers, and so on and so forth, with the result that I'm definitely beginning to feel jealous." At another point in the letter he had written, "The newspapers are terribly late in arriving, and although a lot of the news gets around by word of mouth, you can't believe it at all. You can't believe it all. For example, those musical young ladies you're familiar with were claiming yesterday that Napoleon had been taken prisoner by our Cossacks and sent off to St. Petersburg, but you can imagine how much of that I believe. One visitor from St. Petersburg, he works for a government minister on special assignments, a really capital fellow, such a resource for us now that there's hardly anybody left in town. You've simply no idea. Was stating it to us as a fact that our chaps have taken Eupatoria, that the French have lost their line of communication to Balaclava, and that while we only lost 200 men in the assault, the French lost as many as 15,000. Pupka was so overjoyed that she went on the spree all night, and she says that she's had a sort of premonition that you took part in that assault and extinguished yourself." In spite of the words and expressions I have purposely marked in italics, and notwithstanding the whole tone of the letter, from which the high-minded reader will doubtless form a correct and negative opinion concerning the respectability of Captain Lieutenant Mikhailov, with his own down-at-heel boots, and of his friend who writes resource and has such strange notions of geography concerning the pale friend on the S-shaped seat, he may, not without justification, imagine Natasha with dirty fingernails, and in general concerning the whole of this dirty, idle, provincial milieu, so contemptible to him in spite of all this, Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov remembered his pale provincial lady friend with an inexpressibly sweet sadness, recalling how he had used to sit with her in the arbor discussing sentiments. He remembered his good-natured Ulan friend, who would lose his temper and end up having to pay fines when they played cards for kopeck stakes in the study, and how his wife would laugh at him. He remembered the friendly feelings that these people entertained in his regard. Possibly, it seemed to him that there was even more than this where his pale friend was concerned. These people and their surroundings flickered in his mind's eye, suffused in a wonderfully sweet, comfortingly rosy light, and smiling at his memories, he patted the pocket which contained the letter that was so dear to him. These moments were lent an even greater aura of charm for Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov by the fact that the milieu in which he was now constrained to live, that of an infantry regiment, was far more lowly than the one in which, as a cavalryman and a knight of ladies, he had previously moved in the town of T, being everywhere well received. So much more elevated were the circles in which he had previously moved than those in which he presently found himself, that when in moments of candor he happened to tell his fellow infantrymen that he had driven his own droshky, had attended balls at the house of the provincial governor, and had played cards with the government service general, they would listen to him with a kind of skeptical indifference, as though all that mattered was that they should not contradict him, or demonstrate that none of this had in fact been the case. Let him talk, they would say, implying that if he showed no obvious contempt for the vodka swilling of his fellows, for their quarter kopeck stake games with old packs of cards, for the general vulgarity of the life they led, then this must be attributable to the unusually modest, easy-going, and discreet quality of his disposition. From memories, Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov found himself passing to hopes and dreams. How astonished and delighted Natasha will be, he thought, as he strode along a narrow lane in his down-at-heel boots, when she suddenly comes across How astonished and delighted Natasha will be, he thought, as he strode along a narrow lane in his down-at-heel boots, when she suddenly comes across a report in the Veteran of how I was the first man to climb up on the cannon and receive the St. George Cross. I ought to be made a captain on account of that decoration, in any case. It's quite likely that I'll be made a battalion commander this year, because a lot of men have already been killed in this campaign, and a lot more are going to die before it's over. There'll be another battle, and I, as a famous man, will be given a regiment to lead. I'll be made a lieutenant colonel. I'll get the St. Anne's ribbon. Then I'll be a colonel. And in no time he was a general, deigning to visit Natasha, the widow of his comrade, who in his dreams was dead by now. Just then, however, the playing of the regimental band came more clearly to his ears. The crowds of people burst upon his sight, and he found himself on the boulevard, a lieutenant captain as before, awkward, timid, and of no significance. 3. First he went over to the pavilion, beside which the bandsmen were standing together with the other soldiers from the same regiment, who were holding the band parts open in front of them for them to read. They, in turn, were surrounded by a little circle of clerks, cadets, nannies with young children, and officers in old greatcoats, observing rather than listening. The people round the pavilions, either standing, sitting, or strolling about, were for the most part naval officers, adjutants, and army officers in white gloves and new greatcoats. Along the broad avenue of the boulevard strolled officers of all classes and women of all classes. A few of the women were dressed in hats, but most of them wore kerchiefs. There were also some who wore neither kerchiefs nor hats, and it was a striking fact that there was not an old woman among them. Indeed, they were all of them young. Below, in the shady scented alleys of acacia, individual groups sat or wandered. No one seemed unusually pleased to meet Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov, with the possible exception of Captains Obzagov and Suslikov, both of whom were members of his regiment, and both of whom warmly shook hands with him. But the former was dressed in camel-hair trousers and a frayed greatcoat, wore no gloves, and had a face that was red and streaming with perspiration, while the latter shouted his remarks so loudly and in such an overfamiliar manner that it was embarrassing to walk in his company, particularly under the gaze of the officers in white gloves, with one of whom, an adjutant, Mikhailov exchanged bows, and with another of whom, a field officer, it would have been permissible for him to exchange bows, since he had twice encountered the man at the house of a mutual acquaintance. Moreover, what possible enjoyment could be had from walking with Messrs. Obzagov and Suslikov when he already met them and shook hands with them 6 times a day as it was? It was not for the sake of this that he had come to hear the band. He would dearly have liked to have gone up to the adjutant with whom he exchanged bows and talked to those gentlemen for a while, not at all in order that Captains Obzagov and Suslikov, Lieutenant Pashtetsky, and the rest should see him talking to them, but simply because they were nice people, who were acquainted with all the latest news, what was more, and might be able to tell him a thing or two. But why is Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov afraid, unable to bring himself to go up to them? What if they should suddenly decide they're not going to bow back to me, he thinks. Or what if they bow and then just carry on talking to one another, as though I weren't there? Or turn their backs on me completely, leaving me there all on my own among the aristocrats? The word aristocrat, used to designate the highest select circle of any social order, has for some time now enjoyed considerable popularity among us here in Russia, where one might have supposed it ought not to really exist at all, and has found its way into every region of the country and every social stratum where vanity has managed to penetrate. And into what areas of occasion and circumstance does this vile peccadillo not reach? Among merchants, among civil servants, government clerks, and officers, to Saratov, to Mamadish, to Vinitsa, everywhere where there are people, in fact. And since there are a great many people in the besieged town of Sevastopol, there is also a great deal of vanity to be found. There are, in other words, aristocrats, even though death hangs above the heads of aristocrat and non-aristocrat alike. ready to strike at any moment. In the eyes of Captain Obzagov, Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov is an aristocrat because he's wearing a clean greatcoat and gloves, and for this reason he finds him insufferable, even though he has a slight respect for the man. In the eyes of Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov, Adjutant Kalugin is an aristocrat simply because he is an adjutant and is on thou terms with another adjutant, and for this reason he is not entirely well disposed towards him, even though he fears him. In the eyes of Adjutant Kalugin, Count Nordov is an aristocrat, and he is forever cursing him in silence and inwardly despising him because he is an aide-de-camp to the Tsar. It is a formidable word, this aristocrat. Why does Second Lieutenant Zobov laugh such a forced laugh, even though there is nothing to laugh at? As he walks past his companion, who is sitting there with a field officer, in order to show that even though he may not be an aristocrat, he is in no way inferior to him. Why is the field officer talking in such a faint, indolently mournful, and affected voice? In order to demonstrate to the man with whom he is really talking that he, the field officer, is an aristocrat, and is really being extremely gracious in deigning to talk to a second lieutenant. Why is the cadet volunteer waving his arms about and winking like that as he follows a lady he has only just set eyes on for the first time and would never dare accost for anything in the world? Why has the captain of artillery been so rude to the good-natured orderly, in order to demonstrate to all the men present that he never curries favor, and has no need of aristocrats, and so on and so forth ad nauseum? Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, even on the brink of the grave and among men who are ready to die for the sake of lofty conviction, vanity. It must be the distinguishing characteristic and special malady of our age. Why is it that in the records of people of earlier times not a mention is made of this vice, any more than there is a mention of smallpox or cholera? Why in the age we live are there only three kinds of people: those who accept vanity as a fact that is unavoidable and therefore justified, and who freely abandon themselves to it; those who accept it as an unfortunate but unsuperable condition of human existence; and those who slavishly and unconsciously act under its influence. Why did authors such as Homer and Shakespeare write of love, glory, and suffering, while the literature of our own age is merely an endless sequel to the Book of Snobs and Vanity Fair? Twice, in his inability to pluck enough courage, Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov walked past the little circle of his aristocrats, but on the third approach he managed to pull himself together and approach them. The circle was made up of 4 officers: Adjutant Prince Galtsin, who was something of an aristocrat even in Kalugin's eyes; Lieutenant Colonel Neferdov, one of the so-called 122 men of society who had come out of retirement and back into active service The circle was made up of 4 officers: Adjutant Prince Galtsin, who was something of an aristocrat even in Kalugin's eyes; Lieutenant Colonel Neferdov, one of the so-called 122 men of society who had come out of retirement and back into active service, partly under the influence of patriotism, partly out of ambition, and partly because everyone else was doing it; an old bachelor Moscow clubman, who, while he had been here, had joined the numbers of those malcontents who never did anything, had no idea what was what, and condemned every decree the authorities made; and Cavalry Captain Praskukin, who was also one of the 122 heroes. Luckily for Mikhailov, Kalugin was in an excellent mood. The general had just had a highly confidential word in his ear, and Prince Galtsin, who had come all the way from St. Petersburg, was putting up at his quarters, and did not consider it beneath his dignity to shake hands with the lieutenant captain. This was more than could be said of Praskukin, who had run across Mikhailov quite a few times in the bastion, had drunk his wine and vodka on more than one occasion, and was even in debt to him to the tune of 12.5 rubles, lost at preference. Since Praskukin did not really know Prince Galtsin, he was reluctant to betray to him the fact of his acquaintance with a mere infantry lieutenant captain, so he made a slight bow in Mikhailov's direction. "Well now, Captain," said Kalugin, "when are we going to see you in the bastion again, eh? Remember that time we met at the Schwartz redoubt? Pretty hot, wasn't it?" "Yes, it was," said Mikhailov. ruefully calling to mind the pathetic figure he had cut that night when, picking his way bent double along the trench towards the bastion, he had run into Kalugin, who was striding along fearlessly, briskly rattling his saber. "I'm really supposed to go out there tomorrow night," Mikhailov continued, "but one of our officers is ill." He began to explain that it was not really his turn tonight, but that since the commander of the 8th Regiment was indisposed, with only an ensign looking after things, he felt it his duty to offer himself to Lieutenant Nipritsky instead, and so would be going to the bastion that night after all. Kalugin did not wait for him to finish. "I have a feeling something's going to happen in the next couple of days," he said to Prince Golitsyn. "But don't you think something might happen tonight?" asked Mikhailov timidly, looking now at Kalugin and now at Prince Golitsyn. Neither man replied. Prince Golitsyn merely frowned somewhat, directed his gaze somewhere beyond Mikhailov's cap, and after a brief silence said, "That's a nice-looking girl over there, the one with the red kerchief. Perhaps you know her, Captain?" "Yes, sir. She's the daughter of a sailor who lives near my quarters," the lieutenant captain replied. "Let's go and take a proper look at her." And Prince Golitsyn took Kalugin by one arm and the lieutenant captain by the other, knowing full well that this could not but afford the latter great satisfaction, which was indeed the case. The lieutenant captain was a superstitious man, and he considered it a grave error to have anything to do with women before an action. Now, however, he pretended to be a regular lady-killer, a performance which evidently neither Prince Golitsyn nor Kalugin found very convincing, and which thoroughly astonished the girl in the red kerchief, who on several occasions had noticed the lieutenant captain blush as he passed her window. Preskukin walked behind them, continually nudging Prince Golitsyn by the arm and making various remarks in French. But since there was not room enough for 4 people to walk along the path abreast of one another, he had to bring up the rear on his own, and it was only on the second round of the path that he succeeded in taking the arm of Sevastopol, a naval officer famed for his bravery, who also wished to join the company of the aristocrats, and the famous hero delightedly thrust his honest muscular arm through the elbow of Preskukin, whom everyone, even Sevastopol again, knew was no saint. But when Preskukin, in the process of explaining how it was he knew this naval officer, whispered to him that the man was a famous hero, Prince Golitsyn, who the day before had been in the 4th Bastion, had observed a shell explode 20 paces from him, and considered himself no less of a hero than the other gentleman, surmising that rather too many reputations are obtained for nothing and very much in particular, paid Sevastopol not the slightest attention. So much did Lieutenant Captain Mikhailov enjoy strolling around in this company that he forgot all about his dear letter from T, the gloomy thoughts that had beset him at the prospect of his forthcoming spell on duty on the bastion, and most importantly the fact that he was supposed to be back at his quarters by 7 o'clock. He stayed with the officers until they began to address themselves exclusively to one another, avoiding his gaze and thereby letting him know that he might depart, and finally walking away from him altogether. But the lieutenant captain was none the worse satisfied for this, and as he passed Baron Pest, a cadet volunteer who had been full of himself ever since the previous night, which he had spent in the casemate of the 5th Bastion, the first time he had been there, and who now, as a result, considered himself a hero, he was not in the least put out by the suspicious and haughty manner in which the cadet stood to attention and removed his cap.